Today marks the beginning of the end of scapegoating educators for the social ills that all of our children, families, and schools struggle against every day. Today marks the beginning of a fight for true transparency in our educational policy. How to accurately measure learning and teaching, and how to truly improve our schools, and how to evaluate the wisdom behind our spending priorities. True public education, great schools with great teachers, is the most important civil right of our generation.
Well, with the decisive victory of Karen Lewis and the core slate in the Chicago Teachers Union election, Chicago's teachers sent a clear mandate for change, or at least that's the way it seems. The new administration vows to block privatization, to fight budget cuts, and engage community groups, parents, and students. And the CTU's new leadership has its work cut out for it. In an emergency meeting, the Chicago Board of Education has unanimously approved CEO Ron Huberman's plan that'll plug a $427 million deficit by boosting class sizes, cutting 2,700 teachers, and maybe a lot of other things. And in Washington, Chicago's new education system is being embraced as a national model. Former CPS CEO and now the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, is managing the Obama administration's Race to the Top program. Now, critics are rejecting this plan for its reliance on pay for performance, as well as its commitment to charter schools and standardized testing. We've got a lot to talk about today, and joining me to discuss these issues is Lorraine Forte. She's the editor-in-chief of Catalyst Chicago. Catalyst Chicago is an independent news magazine that's been covering public education in Chicago since, I think, the 1830s, right? right around the time Chicago was incorporated. I'm also being joined by Ramsin Canon. He's a politics editor for the online publication Gaper's Block. In its mechanics section, Ramsin regularly writes about state and local politics and education, and you've been doing that since the invention of the internet, I suppose, ever since Al Gore gave us that great gift. Welcome to the program today. My name is Ken Davis, and I'm glad to have you with us today. I guess we have an obvious jumping off point here with the election. Does Karen Lewis, Lorraine, why don't you give us your assessment of this? Does Karen Lewis mean that something big and new is about to happen?
Well, I think she certainly means a lot of fireworks. The core caucus of rank and file educators is very activist. They've been out, protesting budget cuts, class sizes. They were out before the emergency board meeting where the board gave Huberman the power to raise class sizes. They are very outspoken. They are very anti-Renaissance 2010, which is Mayor Daley's, plan and the school board's plan to keep shutting down schools and opening new charters and so forth. So yes, there's going to be a big change at least, I think.
Ramsin, you jump in on this too, because yes, it's a change, but isn't it in some ways almost a kind of a stepping back? I mean, this is kind of like a union leader saying we're going to go back to the fundamentals of being a union again. We're going after, those fundamental issues because the other faction has been accommodationist. They've just been going along with whatever Daley wants.
Well, actually, I wouldn't really characterize it that way. I mean, there's different schools of thought in unionism, and there's the sort of service model and the organizing model. And I think what CORE is saying is actually the opposite. I think what they're saying is we don't want to do the sort of bread and butter issues, servicing the contract we have. That's not the purpose of a union as a service organization. The purpose of a union is to advance the interests of the profession and the interests of its members. And I think CORE has taken the position that the way they advance the interests of their members is by bringing in parents and students. At least that's what we've seen them doing. Their work with the grassroots educational movement and parents groups and the student groups.
So it's more than just nailing down a 5-year contract guaranteeing a 4% increase every year. It's something more than that.
Well, and to go back to the 5-year contract, back then it was obvious there was not going to really be the money for these raises. But the city, the mayor, the school board agreed to this contract, and there's never been, the district's always been in financial straits for years and years. So where was the money going to come from? It was totally to buy labor peace so there wouldn't be a strike. Well, we'll give them, guaranteed raises. So it does go beyond, I agree with what you said about, not just servicing the contract, but they are very much into advancing what they see as the interests of teachers and students.
Now, this, of course, is raising a huge sort of civic ruckus in a lot of ways. You saw a very interesting editorial yesterday in the Sun-Times saying, no, you teachers have got to give that 4% back and save the jobs because there's only a certain amount of money, and if you take all this money, basically you're just being greedy and you're sacrificing 2,700 teachers.
Well, yeah, I mean, in this economic climate, when people are not getting raises, people in other professions are not getting raises, yes, it does look bad if it is perceived as all they're trying to do is save the raises. But what CORE is trying to do, and Karen Lewis and her leadership, is saying we really need to look at some structural things with the budget. Let us sit down with the board and go over the budget and see where there are other cuts that could be made that don't affect the classroom. And at some point, they may take some kind of cut, or who knows what will happen in the end, but they've latched on to this thing about tax increment financing, TIF districts, which siphons money from schools.
Now, I obviously want to spend some time talking about, we have to reserve a chunk of time to talk about the TIF, but, as somebody like you, Lorraine, who's been around here for a while and watched this going on for years and years and years, it's always the same thing. It's always, well, we can find some money in the bureaucracy, we can cut the bureaucracy, we can trim this, we can trim that, but it's never been for, what is it, 427 million before. I mean, this is absurd.
It isn't that much fat. I mean, and the board has laid off a lot of people. I mean, they've laid off 500 people who I know personally who lost their jobs, who worked in central office. So I don't think there is that kind of fat. I mean, you go back to the whole thing about how much money does the state contribute. I mean, Illinois gives way less of a percentage toward education than other states. And then there is something to what I just mentioned about the TIFs, and that money that would normally go to schools and parks gets siphoned off.
Well, maybe this is as good a time as any. Let's jump into this whole TIF thing. Ramsin, you've written about this, and certainly the Reader gets a lot of credit for being the guys who've been out there banging the drum for the longest. It's always the challenge on a show like this is always how do you describe this problem in a moment without people like checking out and going to the bathroom because they just don't understand it. But as I understand it, you set up a taxing district and a piece of property that is assessed at a certain amount of you expect it to rise, expect that assessment to rise. As it rises, the difference between where it was and where it goes somewhere else. It does not go to the parks, the schools, the water rec districts, and everybody else. It goes, in this case, to the mayor's office, and it's used for other things. We could spend 5 hours talking about that part of it, but let's talk about the schools. Does anybody have any idea how much money has been, I mean, you could say literally stolen from CPS in the last 20 years?
I haven't seen a figure for the last 20 years.
Yeah, I haven't seen either. I mean, what I've read is, 200 million or some such. I don't know, to be honest, because I haven't studied it to that level. But, it is an issue. And it's not just in Chicago. I mean, TIFs are...
This is happening everywhere.
Yeah,
and the suburbs are doing it too.
Yeah, so just to be clear, we're not just pointing the finger at Mayor Daley.
And I think that, Ramsin, you could talk, you blogged the other day about how the Reader has done a kind of a pretty exhaustive look at this. And it's not nefarious. It's not a matter of the money being stolen.
It's a complicated, it's a sophisticated instrument that government can use, and unfortunately part of its sophistication makes it pretty hard to understand and use as an organizing tool. I mean, what usually happens is developers in the TIF will take out a bond issue at the beginning, and then that's financed over the course of the over the length of the period of the TIF, the initial bond issuing is financed by the money that's collected. And TIF advocates argue that the money wouldn't exist. The money's not there. The money exists because of the development that TIF
because
creates
of the improvement in property values and all that.
So they say it's not fair to say that you're taking the money away from CPS because that money wouldn't exist.
Wouldn't be
and that's
there.
what they say. I
right.
mean, whether that's...
And that's the whole theory, is that TIF sort of jump-starts communities and helps them grow, and so all you're doing is committing to leave the level where it was, but you're leaving it there for 27 or 17 or some amount of years.
23 years.
23 years.
20-some.
So the thing that is just astonishing to me about this is that we haven't heard a peep from the park districts or the school boards, I don't know how many different school boards have existed in Chicago since the beginning of TIFs, but nobody ever says, hey, maybe we ought to revisit this and maybe some of that money ought to come to us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the school board is Mayor Daley has, control to appoint a CEO, to appoint people to the school board, and so, you're unlikely to appoint somebody to a position if you know that they're going to be critical of a policy that you support. I mean,
delicately stated.
Nobody's going to do that. I'm not just pointing and saying Mayor Daley. I mean, nobody is.
Right.
If you have the power to appoint, you're going to appoint people who support your policy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the point of having mayoral control.
Exactly. I mean, it's a taxing body, but it's a taxing body with no independence, right?
Yeah,
so they have an enormous amount of power as a taxing body, but they have...
I mean CPS.
CPS, excuse me,
schools,
But it's essentially an extension of the executive branch of the city government, so...
But now apparently there is some talk now about sort of trying to raid the kitty, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what I'm hearing?
From...
Well, from CORE and
mm-hmm.
from some other from some community groups that may or may not be associated with this.
Yeah, I mean, they're talking about it. To be honest, unless you get a critical mass on the, and I wouldn't even say city council, because TIFs are created. They're state laws. I understand it. Mm-hmm. So, you can raise ruckus about it, but you got to get people who control policy or legislation on your side to actually do anything.
But see, that brings us, we've kind of come back around in a little circle here, because I mean, we're talking about deficits at the Chicago public school system that they're just stunning. Every year there's a deficit. But
to be fair, one of the big issues right now is that they are asking to open the books to get some transparency on the budget. Mm-hmm. Lorraine, you could probably speak to this a little bit better than I could, but I know in the past there have been cases or instances where a projected budget deficit turned out to be a surplus later. And this is actually something that happened in D.C. recently, where there was a massive budget crisis. We're going to have to get all these give-backs, and then when the actual budget kind of was released, it turned out that their projection was wrong. And they are not being perfectly transparent with this budget, and until they are, I think it's reasonable to reject a false choice between the raise and the layoffs, for example, until you have a full idea of where exactly the money's missing, based on what projections it's missing.
And a huge component of this is the state, right? The state owes the Chicago schools.
State owes, right now, it owes Chicago about, I don't know, 600 million, 800 million. I mean, they owe school districts around the state tens of millions, hundreds of millions.
And this has been going on for like this is cumulative, is it, over a couple of years?
Well, this is because of, the big budget crisis in Springfield, which has been, going on, but just got really bad, due to the recession. And so this current year, they still haven't gotten their full allotment. I mean, other school districts haven't either. So, and there's been borrowing from the surplus over the years. I mean, it's a huge enterprise. I mean, $5 billion a year enterprise, and
so this is the point where this conversation so often kind of just kind of winds down,
Right.
and you just kind of, and the three of us are sitting there kind of looking at each other like,
going,
well, okay, so here we are.
Right, what do we do?
We got a $427 million hole. Somebody's got to give up something. Something's got to give. Maybe there will be an infusion of money from somewhere. Maybe Governor Quinn, just in time for the election, will come in with a couple $100 million. Who knows?
but where, and then again, where does he get that from? I mean, if
Right.
you haven't paid people up to now, where is
that money
where
suddenly
is
gonna
the
come
2 or
from?
3 billion or whatever it is you
And
need?
let's not even talk about the pension hole, all the
Yeah.
money that hasn't been put into the pensions
Yeah.
over all this time.
And no one wants to, no legislator, really has stepped forward to say I won't say none of them have stepped forward to say we need to raise taxes.
But the reason we ask
Then
you
out of
guys,
battle cry.
right, there's no,
No
big
battle
movement for it.
the reason we asked you guys here today, though, is to talk about the CTU, to focus this thing on the CTU. Obviously, there's this massive problem, but I'm trying to get a handle on whether this new direction, this new leader, Karen Lewis, really does signal a quantum leap in a change in the way they're going to be running things. The two leaders embraced each other at the podium the other day. They're certainly on the same page when it comes to fighting the budget cuts. Is there really a big split in the union? Have they really taken a new direction?
Well, you keep in mind that before this last runoff election, there was, the first election, there were 5 different slates. And it went to a runoff because Marilyn Stewart, the outgoing president, got about 30%. Karen Lewis got about 30%. And the rest was split between 3 other caucuses or slates. So there is just a lot of just angst in the union because of jobs. I mean, teachers feel like they're being blamed for stuff. Everybody got really nervous and upset when Huberman first started talking about, I might have to raise class sizes. They've been upset about charters and turnarounds for a while. So I think it remains to be seen whether you actually be a quantum leap, but it's certainly, veering from, one direction to another to not be nearly as, I don't necessarily want to say accommodations, but not to be
as friendly
with the board leadership as
I
a
mean,
lot more fireworks.
Well, CORE, the way CORE evolved over the last couple of years indicates that there's a lot of potential for a big change in direction for the union. I mean, they came out of activists in schools fighting to stop their schools from getting closed. So it was a direct result of Renaissance 2010 and the program of privatization in the schools. And coming out of that, just the sort of their structure is different because they're built on that sort of activist anger in the schools, in the neighborhoods with connections to parents and connections to community groups, because that's how they fought these school closures. CORE came together around that. Now the question always is, when you have a new leadership in a union, are they going to hold on to that that organizing activist ethos, or does it become more institutional? That'll be a challenge for their leadership that they'll have to face.
You wrote something I thought very interesting the other day, Ramsin, about kind of the evolution of the sort of the activist groups, the school reform movement that sort of came of age in the 80s, around the time Catalyst was formed, and how it's possible to look back on that now and say they were almost kind of like representatives of corporate interests who really wanted to advance things like charter schools, selling tests to the schools, all that kind of thing. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, we see it now. I mean, J.P. Morgan came out recently and announced the $300+ million fund to create as many charters as they can possibly create around the country. The testing industry is a huge contributor to these organizations and to the politicians that champion them. I mean, I think what started as a pretty genuine interest in seeing schools reformed in the 80s, when Bill Bennett said Chicago is the worst schools in the nation, and what started as that has really been hijacked a little bit by those interests.
We always hear that the special interests are the teachers.
Right.
I mean,
it's interesting.
Yeah, it's not right. It's
Right.
not just teachers. I mean, when did they're a profession, and there is a movement, and CORE is part to make to raise the image of the profession.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, a teachers union is funded. They talk about these big war chests they have, but it's funded essentially by small donations by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. Whereas, J.P. Morgan is a corporate board putting up $300 million. I honestly don't think those are equivalent special interests. I think one is significantly, one is a profit-seeking venture, the other is not. So, to the extent that there are special interests on both sides, I think it's fair to say that the debate's been colored by that. But I think the special interests on one side, in particular, on the privatization side and the corporatization side, are given more or less a free pass, or not really called to task. They're kind of championed as innovators and entrepreneurs who are going to get in the schools and fix them with their sort of profit-seeking ingenuity. And there's, first of all, no evidence for that.
You've also both commented on the fact that the top management of CPS for the first time is actually devoid of educators.
And the top level educator, Barbara Easton Watkins, is about to leave and go be a superintendent in Indiana, and unclear who at all will replace her. So,
but there's I would say there's something of a public perception that the charter schools are better than public schools, and yet we're starting to see some longitudinal numbers now, and it doesn't really appear that they're performing any better.
Yeah, and the thing that people or even people in education who are very pro-charter forget that it is not just the structure of a school that makes a school good. I mean, there are good charters and there are bad charters. There are good, traditional public schools. There are bad traditional public schools. And just because something becomes a charter or a turnaround does not automatically mean, it's going to be all this innovation, it's going to be a great school. By and large, the research shows that there are some standouts, but they're not necessarily any better. I mean, it's really a wash.
Right.
And what about this notion that the more challenged students kind of get left out of the process and they get left behind in the public
There's
school?
a lot of, when you talk to teachers in schools in neighborhoods where they're competing with a charter, you hear those anecdotes a lot. And I haven't seen any statistics on it, but anecdotally you hear that a lot. One school on the near northwest side, I sat down with, their school was threatened with closure. They ended up being able to keep it open, but they have a very prestigious charter school right up the street. And what they were saying was that, the charter finds a way to sort of nickel and dime kids out of the school that they think are trouble kids, or, they use fees and fines as like a sort of shadow tuition.
So they can't, by law, just say, you're out of here, but they can find ways.
Well,
is that what it is?
Well, the thing is, and there is data to show that charters do not have the same percentage of kids with special education, kids in special education. So there is data on that. But we hear the same anecdotes all the time. And charters, most of them do a lottery, so it's not like they're necessarily creaming the top kids, but they are getting the kids whose parents have enough wherewithal and everything to get into the lottery and
which is
go and do the application and so forth, and that has an impact too. And there are schools that I know that have admitted that we'll counsel out a kid if we think he or she just isn't cutting it, or their parents aren't showing up for parents' night. So there are ways to put. I mean, because they don't have to keep kids.
Yeah.
I mean, not like a regular neighborhood school.
We're talking today about the impact of the recent CTU election on Chicago public schools, on the kids who are in the schools, the business model, and everything else. And there's a very interesting aspect to all of this, which is that the guy who worked at Mayor Daley's right hand, putting much of this structure together, is Arne Duncan, and he's now been given all of America to play with. And he's taking the Chicago model national. I think that's a fair thing to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
sure
No,
you
it is
can.
true. I mean, they're very much pro-turnaround, pro-charter. I mean, you can't even, one of the criteria for getting Race to the Top is you have to, the state has to have, you have to be allowed to have charters, you have to be allowed to link student performance to teacher evaluation and, merit pay and so forth. So, yeah, they are. That is fair.
And look, I mean, we were talking earlier about the sort of organizational history of CORE and, them winning this stunning, they formed only 2 years ago, and then winning this pretty stunning victory, one of the largest teachers unions in America, teachers union locals.
And the first teachers union in America.
And the first teachers union local in America, right. And they, like we were saying, they were born out of this fight against Renaissance 2010. So you have to wonder if Arne Duncan taking that model national is not going to result in, a similar thing being replicated in cities around, and not just cities, actually, rural states have a major problem with it. For rural states, it's impossible to turn around a school and then expect to find teachers to replace them. That's just not feasible.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, we should say that by turnaround, you mean basically you just shut the place down and start over.
Right,
and
you just fire
I could
everybody.
imagine that would be
liquidate.
really difficult to do in a city of 100,000 people or something.
Right, and CORE's very strong activist slant, or the activist base, comes from a very strong, privatization program. It's kind of like the force on one side created, a strong base on the other side, and that could very well happen nationally, especially now that there's a model for how to fight it here in Chicago, where it was born.
So what does this mean for a president from Chicago who brought in his Chicago guy to sort of franchise this pizzeria around the country, and then within a very short order, the union changes hands to a bunch of people who are saying, no, we don't even like this plan. I mean, what is the national implication of that?
Well, you are seeing more states who have just declined to go after, this race to the top money because they can't get enough buy-in from teachers or, from policy legislators. And so you in this second round of Race to the Top, I don't know the exact number, but a number of states have just said, well, we're just not going to pursue it because we can't, we don't have enough buy-in. And you are seeing more pushback, from some experts. I mean, this past weekend I was at an event where, viewers may not know this name, Diane Ravitch, who's a very, well-known educator at NYU, I believe, very well-known in the field, was a champion of No Child Left Behind and accountability and testing. Now she's switched and saying, you know what, I've seen it do more harm than good.
Yeah.
We need to find another way.
We are just about virtually out of time, but I want to get a real quick, if possible, reading from both of you. What, if anything, does this mean for Richard M. Daley? Okay, thanks very much.
I think it's trouble for the mayor. I think the mayor sees education as the one area where he can bridge a lot of the divisions in the city. I think he feels like he fought really hard to take over the schools, the Mandatory Act in 1995. He sees Renaissance 2010, the turnarounds, and CPS as a feather in his cap. And if it comes down to a really nasty fight with the teachers, especially a teachers union that is bringing in parents and community, that could really spell a lot of trouble for him.
I'm sorry, we have just done it. We've run out of time. Lorraine, we'll have to.
I was just going to say, who's going to run against him? That's my question.
There's your answer. All right.
That's much more
a very interesting conversation about the CTU today and what this all means, and we'll have plenty more. You'll be, I hope, watching us because you've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV, and of course you can see all of the programming here on CAN TV or online at Blip TV. Check us out there or subscribe on iTunes. It's real easy. I'm Ken Davis, thanking you very much for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.